Get in the house. Now. Daniel Hayes had never said those words to a stranger before, and he'd remember for the rest of his life how strange they felt in his own mouth. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of Pittsburgh evening where the streetlights on Butler Street buzz on all at once, like the whole block exhales together. Daniel had just turned the key in the last padlock at Hayes Auto Repair, his coveralls still smelling of brake fluid, when he heard it. A squeal of tires so sharp it seemed to tear the air itself. He turned, and his heart simply stopped. Lily, 7 years old, pigtails bouncing, running across the lot toward him because she thought, as she always thought, at exactly 6:15 that Daddy was finally home. She hadn't seen the delivery truck sliding through the wet intersection, brakes failing, headlights swinging wild across the pavement like something out of a nightmare he hadn't had yet. Daniel opened his mouth. No sound came out. Some sounds are too big for a throat. And then a blur. A woman in a torn gray coat, hair the color of wet sand, threw herself across the lot and shoved his daughter clear out of the truck's path with both arms and everything she had left in her body. The truck missed Lily by inches. It did not miss the woman. She hit the asphalt hard,
Is she safe?
and for one long, silent second, nobody moved at all. Not Daniel, not the truck driver, not the whole quiet street holding its breath. Then Lily screamed, and the world started turning again. Daniel reached them in 4 strides. Lily was fine, scared, shaking, but fine, her small hands already gripping his jeans like she'd never let go again. The woman was not fine. Her knee was scraped raw beneath the torn fabric, her elbow already swelling, and still, the first thing she did was struggle to sit up and check Lily's face with her own eyes, as if she didn't trust anyone else's word for it. "Is she safe?" the woman whispered. Not a question about herself, never once in the whole ordeal a question about herself. Daniel would think about that whisper for years. Here is what nobody watching that street corner could have known. That whisper, spoken by a woman who looked like she hadn't slept indoors in weeks, was about to unravel a 5-year-old lie that powerful people had built their entire lives around. But Daniel didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was a stranger had just given her body to save his daughters, and rain was starting to fall, cold and thin, the kind that gets into a person's bones on Butler Street, even in October. The woman rose anyway, wincing, and started to limp off into the dark like she had somewhere urgent to be, or like she was used to disappearing before anyone could ask her name. Daniel watched her go 3 steps. Then he looked down at Lily, who was still holding his hand so tight her knuckles had gone white. And something in his chest, something stubborn, something that had been closed for 5 years, ever since his wife's funeral, cracked open just enough to let one sentence through. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rougher than he meant it. "You can't walk far on that knee. Come inside, 1 night. That's all I'm offering." She stopped. Turned halfway, rain running down a face that was, he noticed now, younger than he'd first thought, and far too composed for someone bleeding on a stranger's sidewalk. She studied him, the way you'd study a locked door you weren't sure you should open. "1 night," she repeated softly, like she was making a private promise rather than accepting his. Inside, she wouldn't take the guest bed. She sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa nearest the front door, the way a person sits when they've trained themselves never to be caught without an exit. She never gave her name. Daniel didn't push. Lily. Though Lily wasn't shy about anything, ever, not since the day she learned to talk. She brought the woman a glass of water and the old flannel throw from the back of Grandma's rocking chair. The one with the frayed corner Lily called the marshmallow blanket, for reasons no one in the family had ever fully understood. The woman held that blanket like it was the first kind thing anyone had handed her in a very long time. And she looked at Lily for a long, long moment. Long enough that Daniel almost asked what was wrong before deciding some silences aren't his to interrupt. By morning, the sofa was empty. No goodbye. No name still. But on the kitchen table, weighted down by the sugar bowl, sat a single sheet of paper, a diagram, hand-drawn, precise down to the smallest bolt, solving the exact braking system problem that had stumped Daniel's whole shop for 8 straight months. He stood there in his socks, coffee going cold in his hand, staring at handwriting he'd never seen before from a woman whose name he still didn't know. A homeless woman who happened to understand hydraulic engineering better than any certified mechanic in 3 counties. Daniel had exactly one thought standing in that kitchen with the October light coming in weak and gray. Who on earth was she? He had no idea yet that the answer would cost him everything he owned and give him back something he thought he'd buried 5 years ago on a rainy afternoon at Calvary Cemetery. The diagram worked. Daniel almost didn't believe it, even as he watched the brake line hold pressure for the first time in 8 months. Clean and quiet, exactly the way the stranger's careful pencil lines had promised it would. He stood in the bay a long moment, wiping his hands on a rag that hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. The particular relief of being helped by someone who wanted nothing back. He should have known that kind of luck doesn't come free in this life, not for a man like him. Lily at least seemed unbothered by the strangeness of it all. She spent breakfast naming the old vacuum cleaner after the mystery woman, Vera, she decided, because the vacuum wheezed exactly like an old lady climbing porch steps, and Daniel laughed for the first time in days, a short, surprised bark of a laugh, before he remembered there was still a stranger's blood on his front steps and a diagram he couldn't explain. He didn't know it yet, but that small, ordinary laugh over a wheezing vacuum cleaner was the last easy morning he'd have in a long while. By noon, his younger sister Sarah was standing in his kitchen in her good blazer, the one she wore for depositions, arms crossed like she'd rehearsed the pose in her car. Sarah had never liked messy edges, and a strange woman sleeping on her brother's sofa was about as messy as edges got. "You let someone I've never met sleep in this house, with Lily here?" Her voice had the flat courtroom calm she used when she'd already decided the verdict. "Daniel, I've been telling you for a year this house isn't stable enough. This is exactly the kind of thing a judge is going to want to hear about." "She saved Lily's life, Sarah. That's not the point I'm going to be making." Sarah's eyes didn't soften, not even a little, and Daniel felt something cold settle low in his stomach. The first small stone of a feeling he wouldn't have a name for until much later. His own sister, gathering ammunition before the coffee had even finished brewing. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Sarah had spent the better part of a year drowning quietly in her own divorce lawyer's invoices, too proud to say so out loud, and that some small, ugly corner of her mind had already begun doing the math on what a story this strain might be worth to the right person. "She left before sunrise, Sarah. She's gone. There's nothing to tell a judge." "Then why," Sarah said, voice dropping, "do you look like a man who's still thinking about her?" Daniel didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer he trusted himself to say out loud. Not with Lily's cereal bowl still on the counter and a diagram folded in his back pocket that he couldn't stop touching, like a man checking for his wallet. Sarah gathered her purse, gave Lily a stiff, dutiful kiss on the head, and left without saying goodbye to her brother. A small thing, except Sarah never once did that. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched her taillights disappear down Butler Street, and some quiet, stubborn part of him wondered for just a second what exactly his sister was planning to do with what she'd seen. He tried not to think about it. He had a shop to run. 2 days after that, 3 men in suits that cost more than his truck walked into Hayes Auto Repair like they owned the pavement under their shoes. The one in front, heavy-set, gray at the temples, a gold watch that caught the fluorescent light every time he moved his wrist, introduced himself only as Marcus. "We'd like to buy your shop," Marcus said, sliding a folder across Daniel's workbench. 12 times market value, cash, today, if you sign. Daniel had built this place with his own 2 hands after his wife passed. He didn't need to open the folder to know something about this offer smelled wrong the way a car engine smells wrong right before it seizes for good. "What's the catch?" Marcus smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "One condition. You never mention the woman who stayed here, the one with the sand-colored hair, not to police, not to press, not to your own daughter, ever." Daniel set down his wrench slowly, the way you set down something you might otherwise throw. "Get off my property." He never saw the fire coming. Nobody sees fire coming, that's the cruelty of it. He woke near midnight to sirens and orange light licking up through the shop's back windows 2 blocks over, and by the time he got Lily into the truck and reached Butler Street, there was nothing left to save. 8 years of work, his father's old lift, the tools he'd inherited, the shop that had put food on the table since before Lily could walk, reduced to smoke, curling up into a Pittsburgh sky that didn't care one bit. He stood in the rain that wasn't rain this time, just the fire hose's overspray, holding his daughter against his chest, and felt for the second time in 1 week the particular helplessness of a man watching his whole life go sideways because of a decision he still didn't regret. It was 3 days later, sifting through the wreckage for anything salvageable, that his boot caught on something half-melted under the old workbench. A flash drive, scorched black on one side, the plastic casing warped but somehow impossibly still intact. He plugged it into the laptop at the kitchen table that night after Lily had finally fallen asleep, expecting nothing, old invoices, maybe forgotten photos. Instead, dozens of audio files opened, and a voice he recognized immediately, quiet, precise, unmistakably hers, filled the kitchen. If you're hearing this, it means they found me. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is the Aldermont acquisition was never legal, and I have the routing records to prove it. Daniel sat frozen at his own table until the coffee went cold twice over. The woman who'd bled on his sidewalk to save Lily's life wasn't just a stranger with a gift for engineering. She was hiding evidence powerful enough that men in expensive suits had burned down a working man's livelihood just to make sure it stayed buried. Over the following days, a black sedan began parking across from the house each evening, engine idling, headlights off. Once, twice, then every single night. Daniel started walking Lily to school by a different route each morning, checking the rearview mirror at every stop sign, feeling eyes on him that he could never quite catch looking. One night, coming back from picking Lily up, he found the little indicator light on his laptop's webcam glowing faint green, though he was almost certain he hadn't touched the thing since morning. He told himself it was nothing, old wiring, a glitch. He closed the lid and said nothing to anyone, and would spend a long time afterward wishing he'd trusted that cold feeling instead of explaining it away. What had started as one small kindness on a rainy October evening had become something far larger and far more dangerous than he'd ever agreed to. And somewhere out there, the woman with no name was still running, carrying a truth that could bring down an empire, and though Daniel didn't know it yet, a truth that had everything to do with the wife he'd buried 5 years before. A week crawled by like that, each day heavier than the last, until the morning everything finally broke wide open. Marcus offered Daniel 12 times what his shop was worth, cash, same day, for one condition: silence about the woman who saved his daughter. Daniel said no, and paid for it with everything he owned by morning. Team Daniel, he was right to protect a stranger's secret, no matter the cost to his own family. Team Caution, no promise to someone you just met is worth burning your daughter's future down. Drop it below Team Daniel or Team Caution. The phone buzzed at 8:14 in the morning, and Daniel's whole world tilted sideways before he'd even read the words. He'd just watched Lily walk through the doors of her elementary school 2 minutes earlier, backpack bouncing, ponytail swinging, waving over her shoulder the way she always did. 2 minutes. That's all it takes for a life to break in half. A man in a gray hoodie came around the side of the building, moving fast, too fast for a school morning, and before the crossing guard could even blow her whistle, Lily was gone. Pulled into the open side door of a white van idling at the curb, gone in under 6 seconds, the van already pulling away by the time Daniel's brain caught up with what his eyes had just seen. He ran. God help him, he ran like his legs had never learned any other purpose in life, but the van turned the corner onto Liberty Avenue and was gone, swallowed by morning traffic, and Daniel stood in the middle of the street with his hands empty and his chest caving in. The crossing guard was screaming for someone to call 911. A teacher came running out with her cardigan still half-buttoned. None of it registered. All Daniel could hear over and over was the particular pitch of his daughter's voice. Not a scream, not exactly, more like a single startled note cut off too soon. The same sound he realized later that had haunted him for 5 years after a phone call about his wife. He had promised himself, standing at Carol's graveside, that he would never again stand this helpless while someone he loved was taken from him. And here he was again, rooted to a sidewalk on Butler Street, arms empty, promise broken before 9 in the morning. His phone buzzed again. The drive. 2 hours. Or she doesn't come back. No name attached, no number he recognized. Just 7 words that turned a mechanic from Lawrenceville into a man capable of anything. Daniel called the police with shaking hands, then called again when the first call dropped, then stood in his kitchen, holding the scorched flash drive like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had come completely unmoored. 2 hours. He had 2 hours to decide whether a piece of plastic was worth more than his daughter's life, and he already knew, had known the second the message came through, that there was no decision to make at all. He would hand it over. He would hand over anything. The choice took Daniel less than 3 seconds, and it was never really a choice at all. Beneath the panic sat an older wound, the hospital hallway 5 years ago, where willingness to sacrifice everything hadn't been enough to save Carol. He would hand over the drive, not because he weighed its worth against his daughter's life, but because he'd promised himself at her graveside that hesitation would never again cost him someone he loved. A patrol car arrived within minutes. This was still, after all, a school morning in a quiet Pittsburgh neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing like this was supposed to happen. And the young officer took down every detail Daniel could force out through a throat that had nearly stopped working. White van, no plates visible, gray hoodie, 6 seconds, maybe 7. The officer's radio crackled with something about an Amber Alert being drafted, and for one terrible, hollow minute, Daniel sat on the school's front steps with his head in his hands, rehearsing every version of the last 2 weeks that might explain why anyone on earth would want to hurt a 7-year-old girl who still called her grandmother's vacuum cleaner Vera. He was halfway out the door, keys already in hand, when the television in the living room caught his eye. Every single channel all at once, running the same breaking story: Elena Voss missing. Tech billionaire, the world's wealthiest woman, resurfaces after 11 months. Daniel stopped walking. His keys hit the floor. The photograph on the screen was younger, glossier, dressed in something that cost more than his truck. But the eyes were the same pale green eyes that had studied him from his own sofa, wary and exhausted. The same eyes that had asked, "Is she safe?" before asking anything else in the world. The homeless woman he'd let sleep under his roof for one single night was the richest woman on the entire planet. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at a stranger's face on his television screen and feel the whole shape of the last 2 weeks rearrange itself into something he didn't recognize. And then his phone rang, a number he didn't know, a voice from the local news station asking if he had any comment on reports that he had been harboring Elena Voss, that he might have known her identity from the very first night, that questions were already circulating about what exactly a struggling small business owner might have wanted from a woman worth $40 billion. Somewhere between the school's security footage grainy cropped spliced with a timestamp that didn't quite match and a reporter's clipped accusing questions, the story of Daniel Hayes had already been written by people who had never met him. He was no longer the man who'd offered a stranger a warm sofa on a cold night. He was in the space of one single television broadcast a suspect. Neighbors he'd waved to for 8 years started calling the shop's old landline, not to offer help, but to ask in careful, half-embarrassed voices whether it was true he'd known who she was the whole time. A regular customer canceled a standing oil change appointment without explanation. Somewhere in the churn of comment sections and cable news chyrons, a single, grainy photograph of Elena, rain-soaked, exhausted, climbing into Daniel's truck that first October night had already been captioned 100 different ways, none of them kind, none of them anywhere close to true. What no one watching that footage could have known, what even Daniel himself didn't know yet, was that the timestamp on that video had been altered by less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes was all it took to make an act of pure kindness look on television exactly like a conspiracy. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely dial his lawyer's number, a number he didn't have yet, for a lawyer he couldn't afford, for a crime he hadn't committed, while somewhere across the city, his daughter sat in the back of a stranger's van, and the only person who might know how to save her was the very same woman half the country now believed he'd been secretly profiting from all along. Everything Daniel thought he understood about that rainy October night, the torn coat, the whispered question, the diagram left behind at dawn, had just been rewritten in front of the entire world. His phone buzzed one more time before the 2-hour deadline ran out. Not a threat this time. A single line from the same unknown number sent at 9:52 that morning. "Don't hand it to anyone but me. I'm coming." Daniel stared at those 5 words until they blurred. He had no way of knowing if they were real, if they were a trap, or if they were the only true thing anyone had told him all day. He thought of Lily's small hand gripping his jeans on that first rainy night of the way. She'd handed a stranger a chipped glass of water without being asked, of how quickly one small kindness could turn into something so much larger than a single evening. He thought, too, of Carol, and of how she used to say that trouble in this life rarely arrives alone. It comes trailing every piece of trouble behind trailing every piece of trouble that came before it. He still didn't know the worst of it yet. That would come by nightfall, delivered not by a stranger, but by someone who shared his last name. Lily came home that evening. Later, Daniel would learn only the barest outline of how that Elena's own security team had traced the van within the hour and alerted state police before Daniel's 2 hours were even up that authorities were treating the whole incident as an attempted abduction connected to a much larger, ongoing investigation that his daughter had never been more than a few miles away the entire time. In the moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the weight of her against his chest, in the school parking lot, her arms locked around his neck so tight it nearly hurt, and the small, shaking voice saying his name over and over, like she was making sure it was really him. She smelled like the inside of a stranger's car, and there was a scrape on her palm that made his stomach drop all over again. But she was talking, chattering, even the way only a 7-year-old recovering from something terrifying can already halfway to turning it into a story she'd tell her friends. "There was a lady police officer, Daddy, and she had a dog, a real dog in the car, and I got to pet him, and he was named Scout, like the book Grandma reads." Daniel laughed and cried at the same time, right there in the parking lot, in a way he hadn't done since Carol's funeral. And for a few minutes, the rest of the world simply didn't exist. He thought holding her that the worst of it must surely be over. He was wrong. By the time the local news ran its 6 o'clock broadcast, Daniel Hayes had gone from a private citizen to a headline. Investigators, the anchor said carefully, were looking into whether Mr. Hayes had recognized Elena Voss from the very first night and had chosen to shelter her in exchange for future compensation. A theory built almost entirely on that same 4-minute discrepancy in the school's security footage, though no one on air seemed inclined to mention that part. Worse than the cameras outside his house. Worse than the reporters camped at the end of Butler Street, worse even than the silence from customers who'd known him for years, was the look on his own daughter's face 2 nights later, when she finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had clearly been sitting in her small chest since the van door slid shut behind her. "Daddy?" Lily's voice was very quiet, very careful, the voice of a child trying not to break something. "Did you know that lady was rich? Did you know before you let her stay?" "No, baby. I promise you I didn't." She nodded, but her eyes, his late wife's eyes, the same soft brown, held something new that broke his heart clean in half. Doubt. For the first time in her 7 years of life, his daughter was looking at him and wondering if the story was true. 2 days after that, Sarah appeared on the local morning show, seated in the studio with her hands folded primly in her lap, telling a well-dressed anchor that she had warned her brother repeatedly about the instability of his household, that she loved her niece dearly, and that she had, that very morning, filed a formal petition for custody of Lily Hayes, citing an unsafe home environment. Daniel watched it from his own kitchen coffee cooling, untouched in his hand, and felt something inside him go very still and very cold. His own sister. The girl he'd taught to ride a bike on this very street, the woman who'd stood beside him at Carol's funeral in a black dress 2 sizes too big because grief had made everyone smaller that year, going on television to take his daughter away from him. He learned the rest of it 3 hours later, almost by accident, from one of Marcus's own men, who let it slip during a phone call meant only to intimidate Sarah. Hadn't just seen an opportunity in the chaos, she had created it. She'd been the one who first told Marcus's people that a stranger matching Elena's description had spent the night at her brother's house. Sold that single piece of information for a payment large enough, apparently, to make betraying her own brother feel like a reasonable business decision. Daniel sat down hard on his own front steps, the phone still warm in his hand, and understood, all at once, that the last person he trusted in this world had been the one holding the knife the entire time. Sarah told herself every step of the way that she was protecting Lily, that the petition, the interviews, the careful blazers were simply what a responsible woman did. But underneath it lived a harder truth. She'd never once said aloud. She had spent 15 years watching her older brother build a quiet, ordinary happiness she couldn't seem to manage for herself, drowning, meanwhile, in bills he never saw. Betraying Daniel hadn't felt like betrayal to her. For one brief, terrible moment, it had felt like finally winning. It was full dark when the knock came. He almost didn't answer. Reporters had knocked 3 times already that week. But something in the particular rhythm of it, quiet and even, made him open the door anyway. Elena stood on his porch. No security detail this time, no black sedan idling at the curb, just a plain coat, tired eyes, and an envelope she pressed into his hands before he could say a word. "I'm wiring enough to rebuild the shop tonight," she said. "I've already retained the best defense attorney in the state. Whatever they've said about you, whatever they're still going to say, I will not let it stand. You didn't ask for any of this, Daniel. I owe you more than money can cover." He didn't invite her in, not out of anger, but because he genuinely didn't trust his own legs to carry him back across that kitchen without sitting down hard. They stood on the porch instead, the same porch where the swing still creaked at exactly the same pitch it had for as long as he'd owned the house. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Why me?" Daniel finally asked. "Out of every house in this city, every door you could have knocked on that night, why mine?" Elena looked at him for a long moment, and something crossed her face that he couldn't quite name. Grief, maybe, or recognition. "I didn't choose you by accident," she said quietly, "but I can't explain that part yet. Not until it's safe to." Something in Daniel's chest went cold and hard all at once. Not by accident. His voice came out rougher than he meant it. So what was it then? Some kind of test? See if a stranger would still open his door for somebody with nothing to offer back? He thought of Lily handing over her marshmallow blanket without being asked, of every small kindness his family had given a woman they believed had nothing, and felt for the first time since the fire a different kind of burn, not fear this time, something closer to shame at having been, however unknowingly, a subject in someone else's experiment. "It started that way," Elena admitted, and it plainly cost her something to say it out loud. "It didn't stay that way." She held his gaze, and there was something almost pleading in it. "I need you to trust me a little longer, Daniel. I know that's a lot to ask from a man I've already cost so much." He didn't answer that right away. He simply nodded once, the way a tired man agrees to carry one more thing before he's sure his back can hold it, though the question stayed with him, unresolved, tucked away for whenever this was finally over. For one shining, foolish hour, Daniel let himself believe the nightmare was finally actually ending. Then, near midnight, his phone lit up with an alert from every news outlet at once. Newly surfaced footage, edited with chilling precision, showed Daniel accepting a package from Elena on that very first rainy night, dubbed over with fabricated audio in which he appeared to say he knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was worth. It spread faster than anything else that week, faster than the fire, faster than the abduction. By morning, the man who had once been called a quiet hero for pulling a stranger out of traffic's path was to half the internet simply a con artist who'd gotten lucky. Lily found him at the kitchen table before school, her backpack already on, and asked the question in a small, wobbling voice that would stay with him the rest of his life. "Daddy, did you trick her?" Daniel had no answer that didn't taste like ash. He had lost his shop. He had lost his sister, or perhaps he had simply learned at last what she truly was. And now, for one unbearable moment, sitting across from his own daughter in the gray morning light, he was terrified he had lost the one thing he'd never once thought to guard. Elena did not disappear this time. Instead, 26 hours after the fabricated footage broke, she stood behind a podium in a downtown Pittsburgh conference room, packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters, cameras clicking so fast and so constant, it sounded like rain on a tin roof. Daniel watched from his living room, Lily curled against his side, both of them holding their breath without quite meaning to. 11 months ago, Elena began, her voice steady in a way that made the whole room go quiet. I disappeared because I discovered that the Aldermont acquisition, a deal worth $12 billion, was built on falsified records and silenced witnesses. I have spent nearly a year gathering the proof no one wanted found. She laid it all out methodically, the way Daniel imagined she once ran board meetings. The routing records, the shell accounts, the names of the men who had orchestrated it, Marcus Hale's name among the first. Reporters scribbled so fast their pens practically smoked. Then her voice changed, softened, and Daniel felt Lily go very still beside him, as if some instinct had told her this next part mattered most of all. 5 years ago, Elena said, a brilliant structural engineer named Carol Hayes discovered irregularities in the very same project. She raised concerns through the proper channels. 3 weeks later, she was killed in what was ruled a tragic accident on Route 28. The room had gone dead silent. It was not an accident, Elena said. I have the maintenance logs proving the vehicle involved had been deliberately tampered with 2 days prior. Carol Hayes was silenced because she told the truth. Daniel's coffee cup slipped from his hand and hit the carpet, and he didn't even notice. He heard distantly Lily asking if he was okay. Felt her small hand find his own, but for a moment he was somewhere else entirely, back on Route 28, 5 years ago, standing in a hospital corridor under fluorescent lights, being told by a kind, exhausted doctor that there had been nothing anyone could have done. He remembered thinking even then that the explanation had felt too small for the size of what he'd lost. Now he understood why. The explanation had been a lie, built carefully enough to survive 5 years of grief without anyone thinking to question it. 5 years. 5 years of grief he had built an entire quiet life around. 5 years of Sunday mornings explaining to a little girl why her mother wasn't at the breakfast table. 5 years believing the world had simply, cruelly taken Carol from him for no reason at all. And now, watching a woman he'd sheltered for one single night on live national television. He learned that reason had a name and a face and a great deal of money behind it. I chose Daniel Hayes's house that night. Elena continued, looking directly into the camera now. Because Daniel Hayes was Carol Hayes's husband. I spent months searching for anyone Carol had trusted before she died, anyone who might still be brave enough to protect what she'd started. His name was the only one left on her list who hadn't been silenced or bought. I was watching his shop the night that truck lost its brakes, waiting for the right moment to introduce myself, quietly. What happened with his daughter was never part of any plan, but when a man who had already lost everything to these people still opened his door to a stranger bleeding on his sidewalk without knowing anything about who she was or what she carried, I understood exactly why Carol had trusted him with her life. What Elena didn't say into the microphones, what she would only ever say once quietly on a porch, was that hunting Carol's killers had become the only thing keeping her upright for 11 months. Grief and guilt had fused into a single-engine guilt that she'd been safe in a boardroom while Carol paid for the truth with her life, and a desperate hope that finishing what Carol started might finally earn her the right to stop running. Choosing Daniel's house had been strategy. Needing just for one night to be nobody at all, that part had been entirely achingly real. By nightfall, the story had rewritten itself one final time, not through some new fabricated video, but through hard evidence, moving fast now, the way truth sometimes does once it's finally given room to breathe. Digital forensics experts, working off the same records Elena had spent months assembling, confirmed within days that both the school's security footage and the doctored porch video had been altered frame by frame, the very same 4-minute discrepancy that had first cast suspicion on Daniel, now serving as proof of exactly how deliberately he'd been framed. Arrests began within hours. Marcus Hale was taken into custody before midnight. The Aldermont acquisition collapsed entirely, wiping out billions in projected value, and more importantly to Daniel, wiping out the men who had burned down his shop to protect it. Sarah's role surfaced within the same news cycle, the payments she'd accepted for information quietly documented in the same financial records Elena had spent months assembling. Federal investigators opened a separate inquiry into those payments, adding potential charges of providing material support to a criminal enterprise to the custody scandal already unfolding around her name. Her custody petition was withdrawn within the week, quietly, without a statement, the way people tend to go quiet when the truth finally catches up to them. Daniel was cleared publicly, thoroughly, and without ambiguity. The same anchors who had speculated about his guilt now read careful corrections, though corrections, he was learning, never travel quite as fast or as far as accusations do. A few of the neighbors who'd gone quiet during the worst of it showed back up that week with casseroles and apologies, the way people in a small community tend to do once they've had time to feel a little ashamed of themselves. And Daniel found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he still had it in him to forgive most of them. He sat with Lily that night on the porch steps, the swing creaking its same familiar creak beside them, and told her as gently as he knew how the truth about her mother. Not the frightening parts, just enough for a 7-year-old to understand that her mama had been brave and honest, and that her honesty had finally been proven right. Lily was quiet a long moment, turning that over in the particular serious way she had. Then she leaned her head against his arm and said, "I knew you didn't trick anybody, Daddy. I just needed to hear it." Daniel put his arm around his daughter and looked out at the street, where 5 years ago he'd believed the worst thing that could ever happen to his family already had. He had been wrong about that too, but tonight, for the first time and longer than he could remember, being wrong felt like a mercy. 3 weeks later, the reporters had finally stopped parking outside the house on Butler Street, and the world, as it tends to do, had already moved on to its next headline. Daniel was in the driveway that Saturday morning, elbow deep in the old truck's engine, when he heard footsteps on the gravel behind him. Light, unhurried, none of the careful urgency he'd come to associate with her. He turned around, wiping his hands on the same rag he'd owned for a decade, and found Elena standing there. No security detail this time. No black sedan idling at the curb, just a plain wool coat and a paper bag from the bakery on Penn Avenue, the good one. The one that still used his late mother-in-law's favorite buttercrust recipe. "I brought scones," she said a little awkwardly, like a woman who hadn't had much practice showing up somewhere simply because she wanted to. "I didn't know if that was, I can go if—" "Stay," Daniel said before she could finish the sentence. Lily came flying out the screen door before either adult could say another word, and for the first time since that terrible morning outside the school, she ran straight at Elena without a shred of hesitation, wrapping both arms around her waist. Elena went very still for a moment, the particular stillness Daniel thought of someone who isn't quite sure how to hold something this fragile and this trusting. And then slowly she hugged the little girl back. They sat together on the porch steps that afternoon, the swing creaking its same familiar creak, and Elena pulled a folded sheet of paper from her coat pocket, the same careful, precise hand that had once solved an 8-month engineering problem overnight, and began sketching the break diagram again, slower this time, explaining each line to a 7-year-old who watched with fierce, unblinking concentration. "Why'd you leave that first morning without even saying goodbye?" Daniel finally asked, once Lily had wandered off to chase the neighbor's cat through the hydrangeas. Elena considered the question a long moment, turning the pencil over in her fingers. "Because for one night," she said quietly, "nobody needed anything from me. Nobody wanted my company, or my money, or my name. I was just a woman who got to help a little girl learn to draw a straight line." She looked out at the street before she said the rest of it. "That wasn't the first time I'd disappeared like that. Different city, different name, an old coat that wasn't mine. After the third man who said he loved me and then asked inside a month about the trust fund, I stopped trusting anyone who met me as myself. So, every so often I'd vanish for a while and find out who I was when nobody knew what I was worth. I rented a room 2 streets from your shop for 6 weeks before that truck ever lost its brakes, Daniel. I bought coffee at the diner where you take Lily on Saturdays. I watched you fix an elderly widow's transmission for half price because it was all she could afford. And I told myself I was only there for Carol's sake. That part was a lie I'd gotten very good at telling myself.
So it really was a test, Daniel said, and it wasn't quite a question.
It was in the beginning. It stopped being one somewhere around the second hour on your sofa, when your daughter handed a stranger a chipped glass of water and never once asked what she'd get in return. I hadn't planned on that. I'd planned on watching the way I always did and reporting back to myself. I hadn't planned on wanting to stay. She set the pencil down. I know that doesn't erase what it started as. I'm not asking you to forget that part, I'm just done running from it. Daniel didn't say anything right away. He thought of Carol, of the quiet, ordinary kindness she used to leave in small places, a warm plate left on a neighbor's porch, a note tucked into Lily's lunchbox. The kind of kindness that never once asked to be noticed, let alone repaid. He thought, too, that a woman who'd spent a decade being loved for her bank account might not know any other way to find out if something was real, except to strip it all away and see what was still standing afterward. Before she left that evening, Elena pressed a small wooden box into his hands. Inside, beneath a folder of restored documents proving Carol had told the truth all along, sat a single photograph he had never once seen his wife, younger, laughing in a lab coat, caught mid-sentence in front of a whiteboard covered in the same kind of careful diagrams Elena still made without thinking. She kept a copy of everything, Elena said softly, in case anyone ever needed proof she'd told the truth. I think in a strange way she left the door open for exactly what you did that night. She just never got to see it. There were no promises made that evening, no grand declarations, no talk of what might come next. Just 2 people who understood loss in their own separate ways, sitting quietly on a porch that had seen better years and harder ones, while a little girl's laughter carried across a yard on Butler Street for the first time in longer than either of them could remember. I'm handing day-to-day control of the company to my board next month, Elena said, almost as an afterthought, like it cost her more than she wanted him to see. I'll still own it, I just don't need to run it from inside it anymore. I've been thinking about renting that same room again, the one 2 streets over, properly this time, under my own name, with the mail delivered and everything. She paused at the gate and looked back once, the way a person looks at something they intend to remember on purpose. I'm not disappearing again, she said, not from this house anyway. Daniel only nodded, but something in his chest closed for 5 long years stayed open a little longer than it had in a very long while. Lily waved until the car turned the corner, then went back to drawing brake diagrams in chalk on the driveway, humming something tuneless and entirely her own. This story reminds us that the biggest doors in a person's life rarely look big while you're standing in front of them. Daniel didn't know he was changing the world when he told a stranger to come inside. He just knew someone was bleeding on his sidewalk, and that felt that night like reason enough. Most of the kindness that ends up mattering most was never planned as anything more than an ordinary Tuesday. If your days have gone a little quieter than they used to be, here's something specific to try this week, not someday. Pick one neighbor whose porch light stays on too late, or whose mail has started piling up, and bring them something small in your own hands before Thursday. Not a text, not a card mailed from across town. Walk it over yourself the way you would have 30 years ago, and knock twice, the way Daniel's own front door still remembers. You may never learn their whole story. Elena never planned to explain herself to Daniel that first rainy night either, and the not knowing didn't make the kindness worth any less. It doesn't need an explanation to count, and it doesn't need to be paid back to have mattered. And if you're the one who's gone quiet lately, the one who hasn't picked up the phone, hasn't made it to the potluck, hasn't much felt like being seen, consider this your invitation to leave one light on tonight. Somebody out there is still standing on the sidewalk, working up the nerve to knock. Give them a reason to try.
Sometimes the truth takes years to surface, the way it did for Daniel and Carol. But it almost never arrives without someone, somewhere, having first chosen to be kind before they had any reason to expect it back. The soul of these stories comes from human experience, empathy, and courage. AI assisted only in language refinement, so that timeless, usable lessons of justice, compassion, and standing up for one's family could move and educate viewers everywhere.